When we think about reggae music, maybe the first question that we have to ask is this where it belongs in this course? Where would you put reggae music if you were organizing it into a story of the unfolding of popular music in the 1970s? I've put it in here with black pop in the 1970s, but reggae musicians are not. This is not really African American music, right? It's music that comes out of Jamaica. So, having said that, I leave it to you to decide how, especially after you hear the story a little bit and read up on it, how you might see it as sort of best configured. Jamaica is an interesting story in the history of rock music. The way things were in Jamaica at the end of the 1950s is they were close enough to New Orleans that they could get the radio broadcasts that were coming out of New Orleans. And so of the rock and roll that was influential in Jamaica, rock and roll and R&B coming out of New Orleans maybe had the most influence. The story is often told that the Jamaican musicians tried to imitate the kind of rolling kind of dikita, 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 but got it wrong, and it became a kind of a sort of a lilting sort of what ended up becoming the important rhythm for reggae. But whether or not that story and that characterization of it is accurate or not, it's very clear that American music came to them via their close proximity to the radio. And the records were not easy for them to get and not easy for them to hear and to have. And so there were guys who went around and did these parties called the sound system men. And these guys would if they got a copy of a particular record, they would often sort of scratch the label off so that their competitors couldn't see what it is they had. They might be one of the few people in the country who had that record, and they would play them at these various parties where they would go, these DJs, and play records at parties. This sound system man thing eventually made its way to New York and to the Jamaican immigrant population in New York, and was the foundation of a lot of hip hop and rap that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. But for us, that Jamaican scene spawned a style called ska, and then after that, rock steady, both of which precede reggae. The Wailers are one of the important reggae groups that we'll be talking about. Combination of Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, Bunny Livingston, and a number of other musicians. They have some success in Jamaica, but that's about it at first. Along comes Chris Blackwell with his label Island Records, which at the time he had artists like Free, Traffic, Cat Stevens on Island Records, and he was interested in releasing Jamaican records in the UK. That was kind of a niche market because of the Commonwealth connection between Jamaica and the UK. There were a lot of Jamaican immigrants in England, especially in London, so it'd be possible to make a little bit of money bringing those records back, re-releasing them there, and that's part of what Island Records did. So Chris Blackwell ended up signing the Wailers, and they had some real popularity in the UK, but were still relatively unknown and just underground in the US. In 1973, they released the album Catch a Fire. In 1973, a little bit later in the year, they released the album Burnin'. That had the tracks on it that you're probably very aware of, I Shot the Sheriff, and Get Up and Stand Up. And after that album, Burnin', Peter Tosh and Bunny Livingston left the group, and then the group goes under the name Bob Marley and the Wailers. Frequently we refer to the group overall as Bob Marley and the Wailers because Bob Marley became so important by the end of his life. Anyway, that music, as much as we think of those records as being classic records, was mostly in 1973 into 1974 pretty much unknown in this country. So there are two factors that lead to the emergence of reggae in the United States. The first of those is a film. We're back to this idea of films that help launch musical styles. And it was a film called The Harder They Come from 1973. It starred and had a soundtrack by Jimmy Cliff, also featuring Toots and the Maytals. And it became a kind of a cult hit in this country. And so through the soundtrack and through the movie, people were exposed to more of this reggae music. But the really important event was Eric Clapton on his comeback album, 461 Ocean Boulevard from 1974. Eric Clapton had taken some time off to beat a heroin addiction. He came back, was down in Miami recording at Criteria Studios. The album was produced by Tom Dowd, he of Atlantic Records fame. Remember, he was way back in the 1950s, the big engineer for Atlantic Records. So there they all are together in Miami, Eric Clapton and his musicians, and somebody gives him a copy of the Wailers album, Burnin', and especially the track, I Shot the Sheriff. And they do a version of it, but Eric Clapton initially didn't even want to include it on the album. He liked the track, maybe they would release it as a single, whatever, but everybody said, no, this is fantastic, you have to do this. And so the track comes out, and it becomes a #1 hit in 1974. The album goes to #1 in 1974. Of course, Eric Clapton, big comeback, that was news in and of itself. But here we have an instance of Eric Clapton, as in many ways he did with Chicago Electric Blues back in the 60s. Introducing America to a music that, in the case of Electric Blues, they'd forgotten. In the case of here, it was music that they didn't know so much about, and that music was reggae. So in many ways, the first reggae hit that most white rockers heard was by Eric Clapton. They liked I Shot the Sheriff. So what is this new style? What's going on here? Because he does a pretty good version of it. So they start to look into Bob Marley and the Wailers, and they find these albums, Catch a Fire and Burn, and before you know it, Bob Marley becomes a rock star in this country. He followed up with several albums after that, important ones being Rastaman, Vibration from 1976, and Exodus from 1977, but unfortunately dies of cancer in 1981. Since his death, and even really sort of as his death was approaching at the end of the 70s and into the early 1980s, he really became a cultural icon, a guy who symbolized the fight for freedom and peace. Some people who knew him say they don't like the way he's been portrayed on T-shirts and posters. That isn't really sort of the true Bob Marley and all that. But however that is, it's clear that Bob Marley has come to represent a certain kind of approach to a kind of hippie approach to life and to love and to brotherhood and to fighting for freedom, especially of oppressed people. Perhaps that has something to do with his Rastafarian faith. I'll leave it to you to decide and to research that for yourself. But that really is the story of the rise of reggae. We could talk about other reggae groups. When we talk about the rise of reggae in the 70s in this country, we're really talking about the emergence of Bob Marley and the Wailers. Well, what starts to happen at the end of the 1970s is something that seriously challenges rock music, something that upsets white rock listeners so much that they're driven to riot and to be arrested and all of this kind of thing. It's a very, very visceral reaction. And the music that prompted such anger and hostility was disco. So we'll turn to disco in the next video.